with a deep and put-out hiss that sounded like a punctured lung, Blackrot stepped down from his dais, slowly and purposely moving through the crowd of chaos monstrosities to face the adventurers. As he reached the forefront, he looked over each of them in turn, causing them to ready themselves for some kind of attack. But instead, the champion spoke in a mocking, raspy voice that he seemed to emit from his chest cavity. It was as if noxious spores had been breeding in his lungs and were escaping into the air around him.
So it seems the trap has caught more than our intended prey. But it seems that this is a good thing, as a chance to take revenge on those that interfered with our plans before. I could not ask for a better outcome than this. My master wishes you dead, boy.
His hand was outstretched towards Tristram, as if he was directing his own plague-bearing spores towards him. Tristan was about to reply, but had no time to even start a sentence as Blackrot turned away from them, and the horde rushed towards the group, intent on tearing them apart. Tordrad parried a deadly-looking blade and barely avoided the large globule outpour of liquid that was spewed up by one of the mutants. It hacked and heaved, as if trying to find more to shoot at him. Then he found himself forced into a blade lock with a beastman. Knowing that he couldn't afford to be bogged down for too long in one fight, he kicked his leg out, pushing the creature away from him, and before the mutant could spew a second wave at the Kislev-born bodyguard, a bolt of lightning struck it in the chest. Maestro's spell crackled with a satisfying after-echo as he spoke to Tordrad.
"Don't mention it, my man! You'd do the same for me." "Well, you wouldn't, because you'd be a wizard, but then you know what I mean."
Lysandria and Tobias were taking it in turns to fire shots from their respective ranged weapons, the halfling with his crossbow and the priestess bearing the smiting fury that was redemption, her pistol, a weapon she reserved for foes that were beyond saving, so evil that their death was a salvation of sorts, and in this way the Vor subsect of Shallian faith was unique. As one reloaded their weapon, the other took down what they could, but they too would soon become overwhelmed, and as hard as Tordrad and Tristram fought, the sheer amount of numbers made it so that many got past them. Lysandria was forced to the ground by a Skaven, who raised a dagger above its head, ready to kill her. Instead, though, a crossbow bolt pierced its throat and sent the creature flying off her. Its frame was smaller than that of a human, and thusly prone to a more pronounced reaction to strong collisions. The last shot Tobias had fired had been point-blank range. Had he been even a fraction of a second slower in reloading it, the priestess would have been dead there and then. There was no time for words, however, as a large group of beastmen had surrounded them. Tobias had drawn his knife and was holding it with the blade pointed towards the ground.
"Well then, which of you fools wants to die first?"
Dieter was crouched down, gripping his walking stick as tightly as he could, hands shaking. Olga was protecting his master as best as he could, but a great weapon-wielding beastman made it past him, and had a perfect cleaving strike lined up to split the would-be physician in two. Suddenly, Dieter's eyes snapped open and a strange feeling washed over the entire room. The three most attuned to magical energies turned towards Mr. Diath, who was just stood in the epicenter of this strange phenomenon, each of them wondering what had just happened. This confusion was increased, as almost every single beastman in the room was fighting each other to be the first to escape from the presence of the group, or rather, the swirling mass of seemingly magical energy, imperceptible to the human eye, that radiated near Dieter. On the beastmen fled, through the very tunnel they had used to enter the city in the first place. The Skaven below would no doubt be unhappy at this visitation. No doubt the two different child races of chaos would soon be vilified with each other in combat, perhaps in a matter of minutes. Blackrot signalled to the sorcerer, who moved forward into the fray and began chanting the words of a summoning spell. Maestro now had Tordrad covering him, and he performed his own magical response. The journeyman wizard noticed, with his witch sight, that the other caster's spell actually reached out through the ether and swirled as if slowly forming a large shape. The sorcerer was cut off mid-chant, and reached for his throat, wondering why he was unable to speak.
"Sorry, but we can't have you doing that,"
Maestro called to him in a cheery manner. He also quietly noticed that the spell he had just cast had come about too easily, and he was already experienced and learned in the craft to understand that he was standing in an etherically amplified area. The winds of magic were indeed stronger than usual here.
"Perhaps," he thought, "I can take advantage of this myself."
Maestro looked upon the swarming enemies around them. Worse still, there were amassed forces present, still waiting to get into combat, even though the beastmen had already fled. Maestro noticed that the strange, pulsing radiation that had scared them away continued on in that place, even though Dieter had now moved far away towards the back of the group again. Whatever the odd aura-like manifestation was, it had helped them, but it wasn't working on anything else in the room. With that, he raised his staff into the air and concentrated on chanting a particularly dangerous verse line from the language of magic, the language of the elves. After a while, his arm began to shake, and his muscles felt like they were on fire. Beads of sweat rolled down the wizard's face, and his skin had paled incredibly. The amount of raw, uncultivated energy he was channeling was far more than he was used to. He was nowhere near the level of a master yet, and here now he was trying to call upon a spell that he had learnt on the promise to Tobias of not using until he was a fully fledged wizard magister, or perhaps even wizard lord, he remembered the halfling scholar's words. He was rapidly regretting his decision to cast such a powerful spell in so unprotected and raw a state, but knew that losing focus now would probably mean his death. No, he didn't like the thought of that outcome one bit. So he squeezed his eyes tightly closed to help deal with the pain. Even so, the magical flux that reverberated through his being lit him up internally as well, making his eyes able to view the room in a magical white and blue hazy mode of vision. Just as Maestro seemed to reach his limit, seeming as if he might collapse there and then, a rage-filled, blustering black cloud formed out of nowhere and swelled in size until it looked as if it was going to burst. With one shaking hand outstretched, the wizard attempted to control it as best as he could, then slammed his staff onto the floor. This forced a pulse of energy to travel along the line and made his own party's hair blow from the momentary gust in passing before it hit the powerful manifestation of natural elements. Then bolts of lightning shot forth from the cloud, striking all that stood beneath it. Some of the weaker foes were killed outright. Others were left with huge burn marks on their skin or fur. The sorcerer was clutching his right arm, which had been struck. It had turned pitch black in colour, and the entire piece of cloth that was covering his limb had been destroyed by the blast. The wizard fell to his knees, panting. He was lucky to have survived casting the spell, as he had felt as if the very ether itself, fueled by nature's protests, was about to pull him apart for his arrogance. But the fact was, he had done it. That had to count for something, he hoped, pulling himself up from the floor and dusting himself down. What had been an overwhelming force had been whittled down in a few minutes to survivable odds. Granted, Maestro had almost killed himself doing so, but of course this meant the surviving mutants and Skaven would by now be backed up by the champion of Nurgle himself.